and welcome to Colred Plays Raid Shadow Legends. I am Colred. Thanks for joining me. In today's video, I am going to show you how to defeat the Celestial Griffin in Doom Tower. Now, the Celestial Griffin is one of those bosses that you're going to want to farm for the forged materials, because if you go into the forge here, you'll find that one of the best sets in the game, and that is the Guardian set, is forged out of Griffin feathers. Now, the Griffin boss can be a little bit tricky. There are two methods I'm going to show you today for beating him. I'm sure that there are others, but if you want to be able to farm the Griffin boss and get your Guardian sets, I recommend you stick around. Just some quick channel business. We are in the midst of a subscriber push, and I am shooting for 5,000 subscribers by the end of 2023. If you enjoy the content here on the channel and you want to support it, all you have to do is hit that like button. That is the single most important way that you can support a content creator, is making sure to like the videos. But in addition, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and also consider joining our Discord community. Thanks so much for all the support. Let's get back to the video. Okay, here we are on floor 90 of the hard Doom Tower. Now, this is the highest floor that you'll run into a Griffin boss on this rotation. I do think that on the rotation 3, I think, the Griffin boss, the Magic Affinity Griffin boss, will be at floor 110. But this method will work regardless of the affinity of the Griffin. You just have to remember which champions you want to bring in depending on the affinity you're going up against. So the first thing we want to do is go over the fight here. Now, this fight is one where you definitely have to track the timers of the boss. So let's go over the boss's attacks. The first attack is attacks one enemy, has a 100% chance of placing a fear debuff for one turn. This fear debuff, I believe, can be resisted. I find that the most common target of this ability is either going to be a weak affinity target or the leader of your team. Now, the A2 is the Rock Smash, transfers all debuffs from Griffin to each enemy, then attacks all enemies. Fills Griffin's turn meter by 5% for each debuff transferred. So this is tricky. We don't want to bring too many debuffs into this fight, because not only will Griffin use those against us, but when he cleanses the debuffs, he will also get a bunch of turn meter, and the fewer turns that this boss gets, the better. The A3 is Death Gust, and that removes all buffs from all enemies and then attacks all enemies. The buff removal cannot be resisted, and the damage increases by 10% for each buff removed. So you also don't want to bring in too many buffs. Now, you can bring in buffs. We're going to talk about how you can use them, but you want to be careful about the buffs you bring, how many buffs you bring, how long their durations are, and when you put them up. Now, Griffin also has 3 unique passives. The first is Divine Strike. This will attack an enemy whenever their HP drops below 50%, and then it will place a heal reduction debuff on that champion. Now, this synergizes well with the second passive, Celestial Bond, which adds 1 Sky Bond buff to Griffin at the start of each turn. It also adds 1 Sky Bond buff to Griffin whenever an enemy's HP drops below 50%. So that first Divine Strike is going to hit you when you drop below 50%, and then it's going to place a heal reduction on you, which is going to make it harder to get back up above 50% and get nice and clear of that 50% mark. So if Griffin keeps you around 50% and you keep going up a little bit and getting dropped, this Celestial Bond passive is going to proc the Sky Bond stacks very quickly. And that's going to be a problem because the Sky Bond, as you can see, each Sky Bond buff increases Griffin's attack by 5%, crit rate by 3%, crit damage by 5%, and speed by 2.5. So the boss gets faster and hits harder the more Sky Bond stacks he has. Once Griffin gets to 10 stacks, he will ignore shield, block damage, and unkillable buffs, and it can stack up to a maximum of 20 stacks. You can't do anything about these Sky Bond buffs, except prevent them from going up in the first place by reducing the number of times you drop below 50% health, and also making sure that the boss doesn't get too many turns, because every time Griffin goes, he's going to get a stack of Sky Bond. The final unique passive is Fair Wind. Whenever Griffin's turn meter is decreased, the turn meters of all enemies will be decreased by the same amount. Places a stun debuff for 1 turn on enemies with fully depleted turn meters. This turn meter decrease can be resisted. It's pretty tough to resist that, but you can actually resist the turn meter. But the bigger part of this passive is the second part. Whenever an enemy's turn meter is filled, Gryphon's turn meter will be filled by the same amount. Turn meter increases are tracked and counted individually for each enemy. What that means is, let's say you have a Seeker who fills everybody's turn meter by 30% on your team. You have 5 champions. That means 150% of turn meter has been filled for Griffon. So he's going to go. He's going to go next if you do that. So while turn meter decrease is a little bit tricky, turn meter increase can be absolutely fatal. And then we have the final 3 boss passives that we always see: Almighty Strength, Almighty Persistence, and Almighty Immunity. So as we can see, buffs can be tricky, debuffs can be tricky, turn meter fill can be problematic, and turn meter decrease can be problematic. We've also got to stay nice and healthy. We've got to go relatively fast. So we need a lot on this team. We have a lot to think about in terms of how we put a team together. So now let's go ahead and take a look at a team composition. Now here I put together a team composition. I wanted to make it relatively free-to-play friendly. I still need to beat floor 90 of hard mode Griffin, so the requirements here are pretty tricky. And I am a free-to-play player, so I can't rebuild a lot of champions. But this composition can be a good model for what you can bring into this fight. Doom Priest is an MVP here because she brings heals and cleanses, and it's on a passive, and she brings no debuffs and only 1 buff, and you can even turn the buff off if it becomes problematic. For this fight, I'm going to try to leave everything as is. I'm not going to mess with the AI. We're going to see if this team can beat this level of Celestial Griffin. Remember, you have to get through the waves as well. But again, you can program the AI in this fight, and I highly recommend you do so if you're having trouble, or you can go ahead and manual the fight, see if you can get past the boss if you're just trying to progress up into the higher levels of Doom Tower. My other 2 healers here are Scylla of the Drakes, who also heals on a passive, so it doesn't matter if she gets stunned, that heal is going to go off. She also brings a slow and a little bit of turn meter decrease. Turn meter decrease is okay. It can be problematic, but it's hard to avoid all champions that have turn meter decrease, so I wouldn't worry about it too much as long as you're not going full on turn meter decrease. One buff that Scylla brings, which is very useful here, is a slow. I think the 2 most effective debuffs that you do want to bring are decrease attack and slow. If you can bring those 2, that's going to extend your life and make sure that Griffon gets fewer turns. The third healer here is Painkeeper. Painkeeper is basically just going to keep me nice and topped off, and likewise going to reduce cooldowns for my other champions. I want to make sure that Newt and Coldheart are ending this fight as quickly as possible, so any cooldown reductions on their big nukes is going to help. Now, Newt does bring turn meter decrease, but he also brings a really hard-hitting nuke. He also brings some debuffs, which can be tricky, but I have my cleanser in Doom Priest to help remove any debuffs that I get hit with. And hopefully that'll be enough. But you can turn off his debuffs if you don't want to use them, and just let him hit really hard with his A1 and I think his A3. And then we have Coldheart here, who has that Heart Seeker, which is going to be very good here. She also has some debuffs, which can be a little bit tricky. She has a heal reduction and a poison and a decreased accuracy, I believe. The decreased accuracy might help us a little bit, but the other debuffs are just unfortunate side effects. And if you're bringing too many debuffs, then you may want to remove Coldheart and bring somebody like a starter champion, maybe Elhain, who doesn't bring any debuffs at all, or another damage dealer who just hits hard but doesn't bring any debuffs. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and click start on this, and we're going to see how this works. Now, normally what I would say is, you can use your AI to better plan the skill usages on these different waves. For instance, on wave 2, you may want to use your openers and then shut down the skills so that they're saved for the boss. But in this case, I'm not going to worry about it too much. I'm just going to let it play out. And then when I get to the boss, I'm going to manual. Okay, so here we are at the boss. The boss has already attacked me. You can see he has 1 stack of his passive here, Skybond, which is going to increase his damage. Now, the skill that the boss opens with is always going to be Death Gust, and this removes all the buffs from the enemies and then attacks them and does more damage based on your buffs. So luckily, because the boss went first, I didn't have any buffs up. I've only brought a very few buffs here. I'm going to get an increased speed from Scylla the Drake's passive I can't do anything about. And then I also have the increased attack here, which is actually going to help my damage a little bit. And I'm not too worried about just bringing 1 buff. That should be okay. But if this got problematic, I could stop Doom Priest from buffing the team, and that would maybe reduce the amount of incoming damage. Now, the second skill that's going to be used is going to be this Rock Smash. and that's going to transfer all debuffs from Griffin to each enemy. So what I can do right now, if I wanted to, is I could buff right now. As long as my buffs last 2 turns or 3 turns, depending on how fast I am, my buffs will come down before Death Gust hits again. So this is the moment to use buffs. But like I said, I didn't bring many buffs. This is not the moment to use debuffs, because what's going to happen is the Griffin is going to use those debuffs on me next. Especially dangerous debuffs right now are weaken and decrease defense. If you throw those onto the boss, he's going to throw those back onto you and then hit you, and that's going to mean you're going to take a lot of damage with those damage debuffs on your team. The slow's okay. I don't mind the slow. The slow will come back at me, but this is on her A1. There's not much I can do about that. I do want to decrease the defense of the Griffin boss if I can, so I'm going to open with the A3 here on Newt. And as you can see, that's doing a ton of damage. You do need at least 1 very hard-hitting champion here, or 2 pretty good hard-hitting DPS champions. So in this case, I brought 2. I am going to use the Heartseeker. Should be fine. And as you can see, my Doom Priest then removed my stuns. So it's okay to have turn meter decrease. It does decrease your turn meter, but if you're going faster than the boss, that turn meter decrease will be less important for your team than it will be for the Griffin boss. At this point, I can put up my buffs, so I'm going to do that. And now you can see I took the slow that I originally landed on the Griffin boss. This is now a good moment to use debuffs if I have debuffs. So I'm going to go ahead and use the weaken. And then we're going to hit the boss and get the decreased turn meter out. All right, now you can see the boss is going to remove all my buffs, and some of them will not have worn off. So that's going to be some extra damage there. But not too bad. You can see I didn't get hit too hard here. Okay, again, now would be a time to put up buffs if I have them. I did just realize that Painkeeper's A1 gives her a turn meter fill, which is a little tricky, but it's only a single target, so it's not too bad. Now I can go ahead and debuff the boss. Get those heals out there. And now we're going to get all our buffs removed. That slow is going to play for the couple of turns that we've had it up there. Let's go ahead and hit the boss with the big hit. And we should be pretty close to done here. I'm going to go ahead and use my buff. We just lost one of our DPS. The boss is at 10 stacks, which is pretty tricky. But we've secured the victory. So again, this is floor 90 of hard Doom Tower. So this is about as much damage as I can expect to be coming in. The shorter the fight, the better. The boss still got to 10 stacks, and you can see that was hard hitting enough to one-shot my squishy Cold Heart. Now, I do have Scylla the Drakes as a reviver, but realistically, that's why I brought Newt, because once Cold Heart goes down, Newt is going to be much harder to kill because he's a defensive-based nuker. You could also bring in Magic Affinity champions. They're going to do a little bit more damage and be a little bit more survivable. Okay, so this first method really focused on having 3 healers, at least 1 cleanse, reducing the number of buffs you relied upon, and also limiting the number of debuffs with very little to no turn meter control and no turn meter boost. Now, the second team that we're going to use is going to do basically the same thing, but we're going to utilize a block debuffs buff, so that will allow us to bring in more debuffs if we want to. We're still going to have to time it properly, but this is a way to actually get more damage out there by utilizing decreased defense and weaken. Okay, so here is my second team. Now, I have a lot of different auras to choose from, but I've chosen to put Pythion in the lead for the ally resistance. That might help me a little bit. I'm not sure. If that doesn't work out, I could always go with the increased attack from Royal Guard, or I could go with the HP from Athel. So we'll have to see if this team works. I haven't actually tried this out yet, but hopefully it's going to work on the first try. And I brought in 2 healers here, only 2. I brought in 3 damage dealers. You can see they are all strong affinity. I'm going to try to end this fight quickly. The debuffs are going to help me do that, and I'm going to utilize a block debuffs buff from Pythion in order to prevent getting hit with my own debuffs. Vogoth is here to help keep me nice and healthy over 50%, because I have more squishies on the team than I did before. Duke the Piers here is bringing a decreased attack and a decreased defense. Athel's bringing the weaken. Royal Guard is bringing a slow and some turn meter decrease. I don't know if Royal Guard will have the accuracy to land here. It might not work, but we're going to use as many debuffs as we can on the boss, and then we're going to use our block debuffs buff in order to prevent getting hit by it, and that should allow us with our 3 damage dealers to clear this boss relatively quickly. We'll see, it is floor 90, so it may take a few turns, but we're going to try to do this without getting 10 stacks of the Griffin's passive. All right, let's fire it up and see how it works. Now, just like before, I'm going to let this auto, but when I get to the end of the second wave, I will probably manual a little bit because I want to make sure that I have the correct skills on cooldown for that first fight with the boss. Okay, here I am at the boss. This time I'm fast enough to go before the boss goes, which is great. That's going to give me an extra turn to figure out what my approach needs to be. So remember that the boss will open up with Death Gust, which removes all buffs from all enemies. So I don't want to use buffs now. But one thing that you can see here is I did bring in a bolster set. So if you have any buffs from any champions that can't be removed, then they can't be removed by Death Gust. Now I also have Pythion in a protection set, a 6-piece protection set. So some of his buffs may also be protected. That's going to give me a little more freedom to use buffs here. So if you have protection sets, or if you have champions who naturally have their own unremovable buffs, you can bring those with no fear. Likewise, a bolster set increases my survivability early on here without any threat of additional damage. I'm opening with my debuffs. So I've got all my debuffs out now. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up my block debuffs buff from Pythion. And you can see some of those are protected, so I don't have to really worry about those. But I know that the boss is going to remove his debuffs and throw them back at me. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and hit the boss with the max HP hit from Royal Guard. That's a nice chunk of damage. And you can see I didn't take any of the debuffs. So if you bring in a block debuffs buff, you can completely negate the biggest worry about Rock Smash, which is getting hit by all of those debuffs. And by the way, this also fills Griffin's turn meter by 5% for each debuff transferred. If they get blocked, they are not transferred, and so he doesn't get extra turn meter fill. Less turn meter fill means fewer turns means fewer stacks of Skybond, and that just increases your chance of victory. Now I'm going to go ahead and start applying my debuffs again. This time I get slow from Royal Guard. Okay, I think I'm going to get another turn here before Pythion needs to put up his block debuffs. I hope so. I can use my buffs now. Here we go with the block debuffs. And there we go. And again, we negated it. So I'm going to let this auto the rest of the way. We should be able to take it home. Now, I know that autoing it means that sometimes the cooldowns will be thrown off. If you need to make sure that you're 100% here, you may want to manual this fight. Or, you have to bring in either like buffs that can't be stripped, or you have to use the AI, or both, to control the priority of the skills and the timers. Obviously, it's hard to speed tune for something like this. You can do that if you need to. But you can also just double up on the block debuffs. So for instance, I have a Cardiel here. I could bring in a Cardiel with the Pythion, put them on different timers, and I'd have 100% uptime with the block debuffs buff. Now, the boss has gotten up to 10 stacks. I was hoping to kill the boss before we got there, but obviously Newt hits really hard. And my Royal Guard hits decently hard, but not quite as hard as Newt. My Royal Guard is in a Destroy set, not in a Savage set like Newt is. So it's going to be a couple of extra turns here. Now, it's not a bad idea to bring a Reviver just in case your squishies end up dying. And so that's another role that Pythion is playing for this team. We're almost there. And there you go. Okay, so one of the things that you saw there was this worked really well with Vogoth, because Vogoth, when Vogoth takes a hit, heals everybody by, I think it's 25% when hit with a boss. Let's go ahead and check Vogoth. So you can see this passive, and it does say only heals by 25% of the damage received from boss attacks. But still, that 25% heal is another good way to get heals onto your team. You need at least 2 healers, probably, unless you're bringing so much damage you can just nuke out the boss in like 2 or 3 rounds. But generally, for most players, especially if you're in the mid game or even in the early late game, the early late game is kind of strange to say, but if you've just entered the late game, you're probably going to be better off with at least 2, if not 3 healers, and then design your composition around whether or not you have a block debuffs buff. And again, remember, no turn meter fill. That's really important. Neither of these teams had any turn meter fill, really, except from the little tiny bit on Painkeeper's A1. Okay, so just to show you that these methods can work basically wherever you happen to be in Doom Tower, I've gone onto my Noob versus Pro account. This is only floor 50 on normal Doom Tower. And you have to get by with the champions that you have. And I only have a few options here. So one of the things that I've done is I put together a team here. I'm still using Doom Priest. I've got a Doom Priest on this account. She's only level 50, so she could die. And I don't have a reviver. So if she dies, I just lose that cleanse. Now in the meantime, I have Runekeeper Dazdirk, who's got a turn meter fill. And I've got Deacon Armstrong, who has a turn meter fill. So I got to figure out how to use those. I am going to use the debuffs here. I have a decrease attack, a decrease defense, a speed, and a weaken. So I am going to use the debuffs because I can't really shut them off. And I also don't have a block debuffs buff, which is what I would normally use if I were using this number of debuffs. But I hope that I'm going to kill the boss fast enough and stay healthy enough with my 2 healers and the leech that I get from Deacon Armstrong that the boss won't get too many stacks and kill me off. Now I have put this into the AI, so I'm just going to show you the AI. Now I'm not doing anything for round 1 or round 2. It doesn't really matter. I'm just focused on round 3, and that is the boss round. I have turned off Deacon's time compression. This is the turn meter fill. I have turned off Runekeeper Dazdirk's turn meter fill as well. So his A2 is off. Everything else is the same. I have left those alone. But I've turned off my 2 turn meter fills because I don't want those to give the boss extra turns. I'm going to step out of the way, let you watch. I'll meet you on the other side. Okay, so there you have it. Now, Doom Priest did die, but she got her job done, I guess. You know, if I level her up to 60, obviously she's going to be more tanky and more likely to survive, and it would make this a little bit easier. Runekeeper Dazdirk got his cleanses off at the right time. That helped by putting that into the AI, but depending on the speeds that you're running at, that might not be true. And so you may have to manual a cleanse for your team. It's important to bring that cleanse in there if you're going to bring debuffs and don't have a block debuffs buff. His cleanse also happens to be a nice big heal, so that made it extra valuable. So as you can see, you can use this method in Doom Tower Hard or here in Doom Tower Normal. I'm not so sure that this team can go much higher than this. They may be maxed out in terms of the power and the gear that they have, but that's okay. I've been able to get up through most of the Doom Tower so far, and I may be able to find a solution with another champion on my roster to get past the next Celestial Griffin. All right, that is it for this one. Definitely let me know what you think in the comments below. If you have a method I didn't mention here, for instance, maybe you go full turn meter control, let me know about your method and we'll spread it throughout the community. Thanks so much for hanging out. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and consider joining our Discord community. I've been Colred, and I will see you in another video soon.